There are some details in some stories that I'm not fully comfortable giving all the details about. Which families were involved, personal names, but I still think that there's value in telling these stories. So let me tell the story of being a stowaway inside a family's home as I fell in love in a summer romance with a computer. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Peter Healy, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. The terms of a divorce can be really, really weird. My father had the right for visitation on Tuesdays and every other weekend, and also 1 month out of the summer. In terms of the Tuesday visits, he never let one go by. The fundamental problem was that he had a full-time management job at IBM, which meant that he couldn't fully devote all of the time he had been allocated to being around. In the summer, a full month stretched out, and he would still have to go to work. This left me with a lot of time in what was a beautiful neighborhood in upstate New York, but also one where we had relatively limited things to do in the house. There was a small 9-inch television in one room, no game systems to speak of, and certainly no situation where I was going to be able to take in large amounts of information yet. But I did take incredible interest and joy in the home computers that my father would bring home from work and leave in the dining room. This is how I began a very long relationship with my Commodore PET and the IBM PC that would come years later. The neighborhood had a pretty good smattering of kids my age, and we would all go out on our bikes down to the pond or to hang out at each other's houses, in all cases really just enjoying the summer however we wanted to. In that warm weather, extensive freedom of 11 years old, I would make a number of friends who I would hang out with for extended periods of time and then switch allegiances and hang out with others. Along this group was one family that did pretty well. They had a business in town that was owned by their father, and as a result, they had a little extra money to spread around, both on the quality of the home and interest in toys and fun things to bring around. So they were the ones who had a tape recorder first, or outdoor gear, or went out on cool vacations. They also had a very large patio in back that faced the back of a bunch of other houses, and for all of us who shared some view of that area, and for those of us who had homes nearby, it was a natural central meeting place because our parents could call our names and it would literally echo through the valley and reach us where we were on that patio. The patio came out of the living room, and in the living room that summer was a brand new thing, a wondrous thing, an Atari 800 computer. It is so difficult now to translate to people, to explain to people how truly of another world, how incredibly innovative and beautiful the packaging for an Atari 800 was. Atari, not just on the technical side, but the artistic side of all of its manuals and packages, had created this absolutely mystical art style, half reality, half fantasy, that showed people in various states of drawing, ranging sometimes from what looked like basic sketches all the way to photorealistic, portraying very simple programs as being doorways onto another world. There's been a lot of study about this art style. There are books about it, there are interviews with the artists, and I was perfectly poised to fall in love with this world. For the other kids, I'm sure it was amusing that there was this beige piece of machinery with black keys and a small monitor that had games on it. But for me, it was like finding out that a family had a unicorn out back that was inside of a stable and ate sugar cubes and would love to have you pet it. It was completely unlike the Commodore PET that I had at home, which only had a black and white monitor for a screen and a terrible little keyboard. This felt like a next-level computer. We've lost, for better and for worse, the experience of finding a brand new computer that doesn't in any way feel like what came before it. We've standardized on manufacturing and operating systems and modularity. Each machine can have individual flair, but fundamentally, they're kind of all the same. It's just too expensive to try to bring people up from the ground into an entirely new experience. Atari, flush from arcades and home video games, had moved into computers with an absolute flourish of beauty. The Atari 800, sitting in that living room next to a bunch of kids yelling outside, was my introduction into their true potential. It started out pretty simple. The kids were trying to figure out how to make the Atari work, and I was one of the kids plugging things in, explaining how they worked, and desperately going through all of the manuals trying to find the answer to what was going on. Through this, we were able to play Pac-Man and Star Raiders, type in programs, really mess around with it as a toy. And, as kids do, others lost interest. A computer, after all, is just a machine waiting for others to give it instructions, and that really appeals to a certain kind of person. Well, I was perfectly ready to be that person who would type it all in. 10-year-olds just don't have the ability to read all the social cues that people put out. In later life, you can tell, like sonar, that people are getting ready to leave, that the party is over, that the conversation has come to an end. And you can even choose to ignore it, but you know that voice is in the background telling you it's kind of over. But at 10 years old, all that matters is what you're working on. You need guidance. You need people to say, look, I know you've been having fun, but you need to move on. We have things to do here. I think in this case, the family wasn't at all bothered by having another kid messing around with the computers long after the other neighborhood kids had drifted off. And since it was incredibly interesting to me, I just started making it a habit of coming over, asking if I could play with the computer, and being let in. This became kind of natural. I'd walk over into the living room, never without being invited, and then play around on the Atari, typing things in, experimenting with commands, peeking, poking, trying graph paper images that I had come up with to make them work with the Atari player missile apparatus that was built into the system. And that was how, for a summer, I became a stowaway with the family. I just started living there, essentially. I'd stay at my own house, but then I'd walk down the hill, get let into the house, and spend hours there. Now, I'm much older now. I know there must have been some back-channel discussion. Maybe the head of the household calling my dad and making sure everything was okay. Maybe it was known in the neighborhood that this was the family where there was divorce and these kids had nowhere else to go, so it was okay that I was spending time here, not getting into trouble, just being a curious person, and how would it hurt hanging out with a machine that was expensive and not being used by other members of the family? Because they were only vaguely interested in it. There was some thought that maybe the Atari could help run the business, but that was a lie Atari told many times, and very few people used an Atari to conduct business. Instead, it was a tinkering workshop, a place where I could try out ideas and see what the limits were of this seemingly limitless machine. How long I generally stayed there in a day shifted around. I have a dim memory that floats up of being there into dinner and the family getting into an argument. Just a raised argument that families have, probably about a decision somebody wanted to make, something one of the kids wanted to do, and the whole family kind of getting into a melee about it, and then hearing in the echo from the dining room to the kitchen over to where I was, Hey, Jason's here. Keep it down." I think that one got through, that staying all the way to dinner was perhaps a bridge too far. For those weeks that I was there with that Atari, the love I already had for computers blossomed from black and white to full 8-bit color. I learned what this art could be and how the machine transferred your dreams into numbers. I built up a real satisfying connection to these computers, one I could have by myself with the machine, and one that drove me through all of the things that I did in the years hence, playing games with them, communicating through them, taking them with me through jobs and apartments and houses and all the different phases of my life. How this romance ended is a little bit fuzzy, but I think it was something that I just drifted off away from. Eventually, the summer ended. The month I had with my father came to a close, and I found myself back at the other house, wishing I could be there again. At some point, my parents bought me an Atari 800 computer, and that started to live with me day in and day out. I loved taking the Atari apart and seeing how everything worked inside. That was a privilege I could do with my own machine. I could load these games, play them as long as I wanted to, long into the night, and never feel that I was overstaying my welcome. Time went on. I moved away to Boston. I had a whole career, a life, various jobs. But I eventually found myself moving back to New York, to the area that I used to live in. And one day, my brother needed my help with something, and that sent us over to the business that was owned by this family. I walked in with my brother, and one of the sons was running the front desk, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, Jason, what's it been? 35 years?" And it had been. A couple other members of the family were now in charge of the business. It had been passed on to them. They were running things. And one of the sons went into the back room and brought out his father. It had been decades since I'd seen him, and he was so delighted to see me. Age had taken away his broad shoulders and his thick head of hair. He was an old man now. But I could see in those eyes that he recognized in me the kid who had come over every day. And I had a very unique opportunity. I said to him, "Hey, you didn't have to let me come over every day like that. I really, truly appreciate that you did. And it was a foundation of learning that I've used to build up my career and my world and all the relationships I've had. Thank you so much for doing that." And he smiled at me and he said, "It was a pleasure." And I got to shake his hand. A few years later, he was gone, his sons completely taking over the business. But I am so happy that circumstance allowed me to bring to a close the time that I stowed away in a family, because my love of computers was, and probably is, just that strong. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Forrest Fuqua, Mark Pilgrim, Corey Thomas, Emilio Oliveira, and Matt Reynolds, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt.